Hi, all. These are generally conversations between adults after the children have left the table. The language can be spicy, and the subjects can get saucy. So, if you're ready, this is the Southern Fork. Unscripted chats with some of the most interesting culinary voices in the American South. This region is one of the country's vacation and retirement playgrounds. But beyond the warm weather and beautiful scenery, there's a rich culture steeped in community and often dark and complicated history, and plenty of innovation among the tradition. I'm Stephanie Burt, and I've spent a career covering this region for magazines, newspapers, and websites. And to me, the best introduction to the American South is through its food culture and the growers and makers who make it delicious. I invite you to come on the road with me from the Appalachian Mountains to the clear waters of the Gulf of Mexico and everywhere in between. I'm always hungry for that next bite, thirsty for the next sip, and ready for the next conversation. Let's dig in. The Southern Fork is supported today by Stolon Food Lab in Charleston, South Carolina. This hidden gem of a space is tucked into a former machine shop just minutes from the hustle and bustle of King Street. The lab is a beautiful, calm oasis, and I'm so fortunate to be working with them to host Southern Fork Test Kitchen experiences. This is a setting that's centered around all things culinary. From testing and workshopping to cooking and chatting over a good meal, Stolon Food Lab is one of the most unique and thoughtful small event spaces in a city known for its events. The Food Lab is filled with natural light, plenty of space to work and mingle, and an aesthetic that will add a relaxed elegance to any gathering. While I can't wait to welcome you into this space, I want you to know it's not exclusive to the trade. Stolon Food Lab welcomes inquiries about how you might be able to host your next gathering there too. Visit stolonfoodlab.com, that's STOLON foodlab.com, to get the conversation started. See you at the lab soon. One of my greatest quiet joys is cooking from a well-written cookbook on a weekend night. Music on the Bluetooth, and new scents and taste filling the kitchen. My favorite cookbook that I've cooked from this year is Latinisimo by Sandra Gutierrez. Sweeping in its scope, it is an encyclopedia of the home cooking of Latin America today, and each of the hundreds of recipes is approachable and very doable for a cook like me. I'm not surprised. Sandra, who grew up in Guatemala City but has lived in Cary, North Carolina for decades, is the former food editor of the Cary News, an historian, professional cooking instructor, and the author of 4 cookbooks, including this latest. She is considered one of the top national experts on Latin American foodways, and she has a heart for the home cook. Sandra has been awarded the La Dame d'Escoffier MFK Fisher Grand Prize Award for Excellence in Food Writing, and her work has been recognized as part of the permanent food exhibit at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. Welcome to the Southern Fork, Sandra.
Thank you for having me, Stephanie. I'm so excited to be back.
I know. I'm so excited that you're back after many years, but I have admired you for a long time, and this book is my favorite thus far. So I just had to have you back on to discuss it today. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And we're recording via Zoom today. We have had a change of plans, so we are meeting on the screen, but that's the way that you interviewed. How many home cooks? Is it 400 or so?
It's hundreds of home cooks during the pandemic, Latin America. I love Zoom.
You're very comfortable with Zoom.
It
Well,
saved my skin.
I think I first heard your name when you were editor of the food editor of the Cary News. Food editors in newspapers focus a lot on home cooking, or they used to. And there was a lot of recipe content, and your work has always been focused on home cooking. And this book is really focused on the home cooking of Latin America at a very particular time. Like, we're starting to lose a lot of that older generation. And so you're really documenting that. Can you talk about why home cooking is important to you as a food historian and a food writer?
Yes, food to me is one of the most important ways to tell how a culture is evolving. And it's a great and fun way to teach history. It's too bad that most history teachers at school don't use foodways as a way to capture the curiosity of their students, because food tells us where we've come from, where we're going to, what strife we've been through, what wonderful successes we've had. And most importantly, what success our people around the world have had in meeting together, sometimes getting to know each other and accept each other on the plate before they accept each other in real, flesh.
Absolutely.
So that for me is important. Now, home cooking for me is particularly dear to my heart because, first of all, I am a home cook. I did not study to be a chef. I studied to be a writer. And home cooking is something that I've done since I was very, very, like a little girl. So very, very little. And also, I think that chefs today, they're wonderful. I love chefs. There's nothing I love more than going to a great restaurant and seeing what they're coming up with. But home cooks have been the people who are safeguarding the traditions of regular people like you and me. So these are people that don't have to be able to afford to go to a restaurant. They're people that tell us what regular folks eat in their homes day in and day out. And that has always been part of my impact in trying to research and preserve recipes from both the past and the present. So, for instance, what recipes came with colonizers from one side of the world to the other? How many of those disappeared? Why did they disappear? And why are some still being cooked today? How has the connection between different parts of the world continued to evolve over the years? We're living in the most globalized time in history, but the first time this global tsunami occurred was during the first voyage of the Spaniards into the Americas, where both worlds that were completely unknown to each other collided. And so did the foods, the ingredients, the plants, the animals,
The people, the
the
diseases,
people,
right?
everything collided. And so, but now we're going through practically the same kind of globalization where things are changing rapidly and they're changing from all different directions. I don't know why people are so surprised with change today. I don't know why people are so resistant to change, different kinds of changes in every part of our life, because this is the history of the world. It's been constant change and constant flux. And I don't think as much as we resent it or as much as we try to stop it, we will be able to stop it ever, because change is who we are. Home cooks to me are the ones that truly capture a window in time in culture. And if you follow the way home cooks prepare their foods and the kinds of ingredients that they're selecting, you can figure out what the economy was doing in a certain country, what ingredients were in at a particular time, what cooking techniques were popular, which ones were not even discovered. All of those incredible things that make the food that we eat today relevant.
I'm in that vein with you right there along with you. So as you're talking about this, I'm thinking about my grandfather who mixed buttermilk and cornbread in a glass. And when I was little in suburban Charlotte, I was like, what is going on? That old school Southern thing tells a really big story, right? There's a lot of context there about class and about perhaps millworking and the Depression era and access to, other goods beyond corn. I mean, just all of that kind of stuff. And then also too, something that connects more directly to Latin American cooking is the idea that when I was in San Antonio, we never really thought about the Alamo as anything that was like a thing, but it was a mission, right? And so the idea of all these foods that are woven through San Antonio, Texas, that are really originate in the Canary Islands because of the missionaries that were in the missions, including the Alamo. And so that kind of story is really, really interesting to me. And I know it is to you as well, but you're mentioning that change is just part of life. Change is also part of creation. And so when you're creating this really encyclopedia, you have to decide how to organize it. And that's probably going to change how future generations cook. I'm sorry, Sandra, your black beans are my black beans. I am not from Latin America, but now I have the best black beans in my kitchen that I make. So that already changes and shifts it. How did you decide to organize by ingredient? Because it's an encyclopedia and it's also a doorstop. How many pages is it?
It's a very big book. It's about almost 600 pages. It's pretty big. But all the recipes are very easy to follow, which is why I was able to include so many. The thing is that when we looked at dividing the book, there were many ways that we could have gone at it. We could have gone by country. There are 21 countries that I'm representing in the book. However, if I were to do it by country, I would be limiting myself to about 15, 20 recipes per country in order to fit the same number of recipes I fit it this way. To me, that doesn't really represent a single country. And I wanted to represent each individual country, each individual cuisine and culture, because they're all so exciting and so different from the next one. And part of the stereotypes that we have is that all Latinos eat the same food. And it's not true. We couldn't eat more different and we couldn't be more diverse in color, race, everything than what we are. And so when it came time to making the decision whether it would be by country or perhaps by time period, I could have gone from the pre-Hispanic to the colonial period to the reformist period, etc. We ended up talking that, to me, the best way of describing the connection between Latin American countries while still being able to keep us separate is through the ingredients. Because Latin America, the way I envision it, is like a quilt of different patches. And each patchwork, if you imagine a quilt of a lot of colors and a lot of patches, and each patch is vibrant with different aspects that have been sewn together and everything, that's that each individual country is that diverse and that different and that special. So then you're only looking at a patch. But when you sew them together, you start getting the big picture and this beautiful explosion of colors and vibrancy and history and flavor and all of this. And what ties them together are the ingredients. That's the thread. It's the different ingredients because that's what we have in common.
Mm-hmm. I know you grew up in Guatemala City. Yeah. So I have to ask you, home cooking from Guatemala City, can you tell me one of the main ingredients that you remember growing up and seeing at the dinner table?
Well, definitely I would have to start with corn. Corn is such a backbone of Latin American cuisine. And we had corn in many ways. We would eat them, corn on the cob with butter and lime. That's what we used to put on ours, lots of lime, or with crema and cheese, which is more of a Mexican way of eating it. But also we would have it in porridges, we would have it in cakes, we would have it in puddings, we would have it in different ways. The thing about Latin American cooking is that each country grabs from different cultures in the world. And when you talk about Guatemalan home cooking, the biggest influences in Guatemalan cuisine are Mayan first, but not only one Mayan culture. There are existing today more than 20 Mayan cultures with 20 different languages and 20 different culinary traditions that still exist today. So you can only imagine how many come into play. And then Western European. So you have the Spanish, of course, who were the ones who first colonized, but you also have the French and you also have the Italian. And then all of a sudden you find your Eastern European vein with the Hungarians and they come into play and all these things start mixing. And a huge influence, which is what I think makes Latin America so underappreciated and so underserved by people because they don't realize how important this is, the African vein. Because the indigenous people of the Americas were killed and they were either killed by human beings and, war and conquest or by diseases. Like you mentioned in the beginning, smallpox went through millions of people and that disease did not exist here before the colonizers arrived. Particularly the Portuguese were the first ones to bring enslaved people from Africa. They were trying to replace the labor that they were losing in big numbers to keep their quotas of sugar and silver, et cetera, that they had. And every single country in Latin America had the tarnish of slavery. But I always try to find the silver lining in history, because history, if you look at it from day one, from the time that the Milky Way supposedly exploded, and that was violent enough, to where we are today, find the silver lining in order to not become bitter and not become unforgiving, and to be able to move forward with some kind of hope for the next generation. And so for me, that is, okay, what was different with the situation of the enslaved Africans in Latin America that makes this a silver lining? What we are left with are two things. The fact that in Latin America, the Spanish colonizers first, but the Iberian colonizers, that being Spain and Portugal, believed that instead of keeping races apart, it was easier to govern people who were mixed. So in Latin America, mixed marriages and mixed relationships began from the very beginning, and they were accepted. Latin America is much more classist than it is racist. Let's put it that way. And then the beauty is the fact that the Africans also brought with them a lot of ingredients, not that they brought them, but they were brought with them, and throughout the years, and that mixed with our ingredients in the Americas, and also culinary traditions that were very, very similar. For instance, barbacoa is a Taino culinary term. Taino Indians were the indigenous people of the Dominican Republic, which was called La Española. They actually made up the word barbacoa, and they were the ones that were first observed by the Spaniards to cook meat on a stick directly over fire.
But of course, we have to admit that worldwide there were people cooking meat on a stick.
Everywhere, right? Everywhere.
Yeah. I mean, that's the way
ones to do it. They were the first.
That's the way I would cook it. I wouldn't just hold it with my hand. I put it on.
A lightning hit the tree, and you had a cow there, or whatever it is that they were, bison, and they put it in the fire. Yeah, but the term itself, especially since we're in the South, you and I, barbecue is something that Southerners, we feel so proud of, right?
Right.
That doesn't mean we have to stop being proud of it in the South. What I'm saying is, the Africans were the ones, because they were the ones cooking, they were the ones in the kitchens, they were the ones that were working really in the backs of homes, along with a lot of the indigenous people in Latin America. But it's the Africans that actually start disseminating the culture of barbecue until it reaches the South. And today, to this point, I think that when we think Black food, we think barbecue. And yet in Latin America, we call it different things. We call it asados, we call it churrascos, we call it all sorts of different words. It's still, churrascos, churrascaria, it's still barbecue. So it's the same term. So that fascinates me. The fact that, people, they don't realize all the commonalities that we can find through the history of food, but through very simple food. We don't have to go into a restaurant that is fusing things deliciously, I'm sure, but fusing them by the creativity of a human being who is trying to connect ingredients and flavors in their own mind. Here, the fusion occurred organically. People meeting in the same territory with familiar ingredients or different ingredients altogether, tried to recreate dishes they remembered, or recreating new dishes with new things that they were getting. And home cooks, I think, they need to be celebrated more. Home cooks, we really are the ones that dictate what the majority of people are eating. Restaurants are the ones that get the fanfare and they get the recognition, but home cooks are the ones that are creating the culture, the food culture really of a place.
And as a researcher, thinking about all the home cooks that you reached out to across Latin America, I know that you've encountered this. I mean, I have people in my family, they don't want to give you the whole recipe, right? They want to leave something out so that it doesn't quite do what it does when they do it. Did you encounter that when you were writing? Did you encounter people that were A, not interested in giving their recipes, or B, not understanding why they were important?
No, actually, it's interesting. The way that I found this, that you're talking about, this element, was when I started researching the books starting in the 14th, 15th century, and the very first books in the 15th and 16th century from Latin America and coming all the way up to present day. Mm-hmm. Latin American books are still very vague in the way that they're written. It's a different culture. People still learn a lot from home cooks, from their grandmothers, from their mothers. But as our younger generations in Latin America are also becoming much more modern, and they're two people in a family have to work. So the kids go to school and the parents have to come back and see what they can do. It's not a passed down generational tradition anymore. But what I found was that in the books, I would find things like Sunday roast. Season the chicken the way you would season it every Sunday. Cook it until it's done. Eat. So I had to start finding.
Why did you feel like you needed to write that down? That gives me nothing.
What kind of a recipe is that, right? So I had to start finding in all the history books and going back through thousands and thousands of recipes, what were the most common spices that people were using in different countries on Sunday? That kind of a thing. Were the religious limitations, things like that. That is just to find explanation for the very old recipes. But with modern cooks, what happened and the way that I moved around that is that for most of the people that I interviewed, we would choose one recipe, or I would pick a recipe, and let's say we were going to talk about let me find one that was common. The cocidos or the sancochos, which is like our boiled pot, where you have your beef and your vegetables, or pork and vegetables, and you cook them together, similar to what New Englanders call a boiled pot, okay?
Or a pot roast.
Or, without the sauce, just more of a soup. But yes, like a pot roast. And I would get women from the same place, or men, chefs, non-chefs, everybody, just say, we're going to have a meeting. We're going to discuss this dish. You can either cook along with me, or you can talk to me about how you cook it, which is how they develop more into the latter. And so we had sometimes 10 people. Sometimes we had 26 people in the Zoom calls. Sometimes we had 40. And they all had their own versions of the same dish. And depending on what region of the same country they were from, they were cooking it differently. Sometimes people who were from the exact same town were cooking it completely different. So that's what made it so valuable for me to be able to interview so many people, because I was able to find the similarities and the differences, and to build recipes upon the similarity to represent a region or a place or a country.
I love that. And that's very complicated work, Sandra. That's extremely complicated work. So I know you're your own tester. Is there one recipe that stands out that really taught you something that you didn't know before, like a technique, or surprised you in general?
Oh, that's a great question. But I'm just going to start by saying I am my own tester first, but I do have a lot of testers that test second and third trials. And then I have a professional tester that makes sure that they all work.
Yes.
Because that's very important to me.
Also, too, before I probably should pop in and say, Southern Fork listeners should be, if they're regular listeners, used to me talking about testing when it comes to recipes and recipe writing as a skill with that person's style. And they're talking to you because it's really like a retelling of what they would do if they were beside you. But there's also standard ways that you have to do it. So you have to have somebody who doesn't know that person and who doesn't know the cuisine to make sure it works, right?
Absolutely. A test of a good recipe is that anybody who can read it can make it.
Right.
Because all they have to do is follow the steps, and hopefully the author doesn't assume that they already knew something,
Yeah, like put the Sunday spices on.
Sunday spices. Exactly. Tell me oregano and black pepper and salt, and I'll know what to do. But what are your Sunday spices? But the technique that most surprised me, I've been cooking it since I was a little girl, of course, but I didn't realize all the different nuances and differences they were from one recipe, are sofritos. And sofritos are the base of flavor in Latin American cuisine. You've got mirepoix in France. You've got the Trinity, in New Orleans, in our country here in the United States. You've got a sofrito type of thing also in Italy. But the sofrito I'm talking about comes from the sofregit, which was made by the Catalan in the 12th century, something like that, when the first book came out. And you start reading of a mixture of onions and olive oil that is cooked as a base for all the other recipes. Once you got to the Americas, it came already as a mixture of onion, garlic, and oil. And those were the bases. But in Latin America, depending on what country they landed, different ingredients made it to that base. So for instance, in the Latin Caribbean, you will find anato or achiote, which is the seed that gives cheddar cheese its orange color. So you've all had it. You're eating it. Cheddar cheese is really white. And it's the one thing that adds that yellow color. It's a seed, a tiny seed. It has a little bit of an acridity, acid flavor, but very, very subtle. But it gives vibrant color to foods. In other countries, they would add tomatoes. In other countries, of course, chiles, hot chiles were added. But not every country eats hot chiles. So, for instance, again, in Puerto Rico and in Cuba, they were adding ajís dulces or sweet, small peppers. And so depending on where you were going, you were finding cumin, for instance, in Colombia and Venezuela was added. While in Guatemala, you would never add cumin to a sofrito. You would always add bay leaf and thyme. So it depended. One simple base could create so many different flavors and cuisines, to the point that I tell my readers, if you make that one pot of beans and you want to taste Latin America throughout, just change the flavor base each time you serve it.
Wow. That's really, really cool. I know sofrito as a tomato base. So that must be Mexico, right? Mexico,
yeah.
Right? This is a monumental achievement. And I'm just really proud of you as a colleague.
Thank you.
I have to say, I already know that your wheels are turning, because they're always turning. Even if you have a summer garden, even if you have grandchildren to kiss and hug in the kitchen, what is making you hungry? What's next for you, the writer?
I think that the windows that are left open to discover in Latin American cuisines are many. And so I'm starting to study and to see what kinds of books my readers and my people that I talked to during the interviews, the kind of recipes that were not mentioned in the book. Am I going to go with fried food? Am I going to go with baked food? What is it that is missing that I could add into the equation and still be able to investigate the wholeness of Latin America, not by country, but by the whole continent. So that's what's making me hungry.
Good. That makes me hungry too. What is one aspect of this job that really meshes with the natural aspect of your personality?
I'm an introvert. I don't mind people. I appear to be very extroverted when I'm teaching and I'm surrounded by people, but I also love my alone time. And so I really, really value and enjoy the research. Mm-hmm. I'm very curious also. So if I find a question like this Sunday seasoning, for me, all of a sudden that becomes like a mystery. Ooh, what do they mean? I have to find out what that is, And so that just, it gets my juices flowing in a way, my creative juices flowing and my curiosity come together, but they allow me to do it in the privacy of my home or in the library or wherever I am comfortable before I have to go out and show it to the world.
Yeah, I get that. I wouldn't know that you were an introvert because I've only ever seen you extroverted because I'm around you.
Yeah, I think it's because there's a term called ambivert where you have both. I think I'm that, but I
have both.
I go more the introvert way.
I love that. I think research is such an important skill, and I think we're realizing that it can degrade very quickly. Mm-hmm. And I love researching as well, but sometimes what we find interesting, Sandra, the people at our cocktail parties might not, because I wanted to talk about the processing problems with cows in the American South, and nobody wants to hear about that. They don't want to hear about the slaughterhouse. And
you're at the wrong party.
I know. So I want to know, is there something keeping you up at night?
Yes. Right now, what's keeping me up at night is the future of the world, peace. I want peace, but also I worry that the next generation is finding it so impossible to buy food. It's so expensive. So one of the things, like you mentioned, I grow my own food in my garden. I wish that they would teach that in schools, that they would teach kids to sow seeds and grow food and become comfortable with bugs and, how do you organically deal with a pest without being mean to the environment and all those things. But it's not out of an ecological, grandiose, I want to be a saintly kind of person. It's because I worry about the next generation not being able to source their own food. Especially fresh food. We have a lot of food deserts. We have a lot of people who simply right now are finding it really, really hard to stretch their budget. And that keeps me up at night. That literally will wake me up at night saying, oh, maybe if they learn how to make this recipe, it's so simple and you don't need that much meat. You can really use a lot more vegetables, or vegetables like these are not available, but the basics of tomatoes and onions, for instance, are available all over the place. Maybe they can, that kind of a thing is what's always going around in my mind, because home cooks, especially in Latin America, Latin American cooking is not wealthy cooking. It's very simple cooking. In a way, it's very similar to Southern food, with traditional Southern food. It's what people can do with what they have, and they create deliciousness, really, with so much soul, so much love, so much effort. And yet it's not because the ingredients are expensive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so that is part of what worries me about my children and my grandchildren, is making sure that I teach them, how to sow food, how to scavenge and find food outside. Don't throw those dandelions if they haven't been spread with spray. You can make really nice dandelion green empanadas and things like that.
Yeah.
And make it super, super exciting without being expensive. So that keeps me up at night. The future.
One of the most independent things you could do, the act of independence, really, Nigella Lawson says, is being able to cook for oneself. And then adding in the fact that if you can grow something in a pot, that's something that you don't have to buy. And purchasing food has never been something that people did totally. They always grew some of their own food, really, until 1950s.
That's right, until the supermarkets.
Yeah, until the rise of the supermarkets. But that's more nerd talk for us. Like, that's my world. That's food systems world that I love so much. But I am so honored to have you on the show again. I have loved getting to know you through the years, through this work. And this last question is a magic picnic basket question. So instead of a death for a meal, I want to bring you some things that bring you life. This does not have to be a traditional picnic. It can be just some things that really, when I say, what are some of your favorite foods that I can put in there? Now, there's a couple twists. With this basket, I can time travel. I can go back and ask anybody to make just one more bite. I can cook for you a little bit, and I can source for you. So I know it shifts and changes, but what can I put in that basket for you today?
Oh my goodness. If you could get me some of the wonderful green mangoes that we have in Latin America that are still hard and green, and we could shave them and then make a lemon juice marinade and add some toasted pumpkin seeds, that would be definitely in my basket. I would also love to have some fresh tortillas, and personally, some kind of bean, particularly made into a paste, not refried necessarily, but thick and spreadable, so that we could put that with some of the wonderful Latin American cheeses like queso fresco or queso zacapa or quesadilla cheese or telera, something that we could find and eat simple. And I would love some fresh fruit that we could pick. If you could go to let's say Peru and get me some lucuma, and go to Guatemala and get me some pitaya, or passion fruit, as you would call it. And then maybe go to Mexico and get us some nice tuna or the fruit of the papa tree. We could make a really nice fruit salad that we could eat underneath the shadow of a tree. And to drink, don't forget to drink. Please bring us some really cold ice horchata, which is a rice milk drink. And I'm going to say, why not? Get us some cerveza, some beer.
Okay, that sounds great. If people want to learn more about Latinisimo and Sandra Gutierrez, other books, you know where to go. You can go to thesouthernfork.com. If you go to thesouthernfork.com, I'm going to have links there as well as images so you can see the face behind the voice. I actually cook alongside Sandra very often in my kitchen, especially with this new book. And I really love having cookbook authors on because I feel like I already know them because I've cooked with them. And that is the first way to me that cooking brings us together, is when we share recipes. So thank you for collecting and keeping these recipes safe for us and for the next generation. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I love knowing you too. And I look forward to our next conversation at a party where people want to talk about all you want to talk about.
I'll try to keep the meat processing to a minimum.
There you go. Just don't invite vegetarians that day. Okay?
Thanks so much, Sandra.
Thank you. Take care.
Hello, and welcome to Talking with a Mouthful. Now, I know that sometimes when you are cooking from a new cookbook, you have to build up new ingredients in your pantry. And if you are listening to this and you are in the American South, then let me tell you, Latin American grocery stores are plentiful these days. When I started writing for newspapers back in the 90s, I remember watching the rise of Latin American grocery stores and Spanish-speaking grocery stores during that time. It was a phenomenon that I noticed way back then, but now we definitely have a lot of access to really, really great ingredients from the Latin American table all throughout the South. Now, if you're in an area like Sandra in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, you have something called Super G, or in her case, H Mart, which is going to have a lot of different international ingredients and foods. But even in South Carolina or in other areas of the South, Compare Foods is a great grocery store to hit. And then there are still a lot of mom and pop grocery stores. I have been going to one in West Columbia every so often and getting some really good queso fresco. That's where I get my limes. They have big bunches of cilantro. Let me just give you a side tip from a serious home cook right here. You want to go to international grocery stores such as Buford Highway Farmers Market in Atlanta, or the aforementioned grocery store I mentioned in West Columbia, or Compare Foods, or Super G, or H Mart for herbs. Get away from buying those tiny, tiny packs, those little plastic packs of herbs. You need a lot more herbs for serious cooking than that tiny pack. International grocery stores are where it's at. You're going to be able to find a lot of herbs, a lot of greens. In the case of cooking from Latinisimo, you're going to pretty much at most of these stores be able to find all the ingredients that you need. And heads up, if you are a traditional big box shopper, you're going to find, depending on the grocery store that you visit, that you frequent, you're going to find a lot of Latin American foods in your everyday run-of-the-mill Publix or Harris Teeter or Kroger or Albertsons. There's a lot of ingredients right there. So please take time to make one of these recipes from this book. Take time to look for it. I have had such a joyful time cooking from this book, and I'm not stopping. So until next time, thanks for listening, and I'll be right here on the mic.
You've been listening to The Southern Fork. I can't wait to bring you more culinary conversations. But in the meantime, I have one question. Are you going to eat all that?